The sharp hum of the airport intercom cut through the air as the last of the first-class passengers trickled onto the plane. Among them was a well-dressed couple with a small child, their movements calm but purposeful. The father, tall and composed, adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy blazer, while his wife gently guided their son forward, her hand firm but warm against his tiny palm. The boy, no older than 5, clutched a small toy plane, oblivious to the world around him. At first glance, they were just another affluent family embarking on a journey. But the tension started the moment they entered the first-class cabin. The flight attendant, Veronica Summers, stiffened as she caught sight of them. Her gaze lingered just a second too long, her expression tightening in a way only noticeable to someone paying attention. She watched as the man led his family to their seats, glancing at the ticket numbers before placing their carry-ons in the overhead bin. He moved with the effortless confidence of someone used to these surroundings, but that didn't sit right with Veronica. Something about them felt off. As she approached, her heels clicked sharply against the carpeted floor. She forced a smile, professional but clipped, and stopped beside the man's seat. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. "May I see your boarding passes?" The man, James, looked up unfazed. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the tickets, handing them over without hesitation. His wife, Celeste, glanced up, sensing the slight edge in the attendant's voice. Veronica studied the tickets with an unnecessary level of scrutiny, her brows knitting together as she double-checked the details. Then she looked back at James, her lips parting slightly before pressing into a thin line. "One moment, please," she said before turning sharply and walking toward the front of the cabin. James exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. He didn't need to look at Celeste to know what she was thinking. "What was that about?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. He shook his head, giving her a reassuring squeeze on the hand. "Probably nothing," he said, though the slight tension in his jaw betrayed his thoughts. From the corner of his eye, he saw other passengers casting quick glances in their direction before looking away. It was subtle, but noticeable. Meanwhile, Veronica disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. She pulled out her phone and called the front desk. "I have a situation," she murmured, keeping her voice low. "There's a family in first class. Their tickets say they belong here, but are you sure they were booked correctly?" A pause. Then the voice on the other end responded, slightly confused. "Their reservation was confirmed weeks ago. Is there an issue?" Veronica hesitated, her grip tightening around the phone. "No," she muttered, hanging up. But instead of returning with an apology, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and marched back into the cabin. James barely looked up as she stopped beside him again. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice more clipped this time. "It appears there's been a seating issue. I'll need you to step aside for a moment." Celeste frowned. "What kind of issue?" Veronica avoided eye contact. "Just a minor mistake. If you could follow me, we'll get it sorted out." James studied her for a long moment, then slowly stood, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. "All right," he said, his tone even. He shot a quick glance at Celeste, silently telling her to stay put with their son. She nodded, though her fingers tightened slightly around Liam's small hand. As James followed Veronica toward the galley, whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged curious glances, while others pretended not to notice. But Celeste felt the weight of their stares. She turned to Liam, who was watching his father disappear behind the curtain. "Mommy, where's Daddy going?" he asked, his voice small. She forced a smile, brushing a hand over his curls. "Just fixing something, sweetheart." But deep down, she knew it was more than that, and she had a feeling things were about to escalate. James stepped into the galley, the soft hum of the engines filling the narrow space. Veronica followed closely behind, her posture stiff, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow, making the tension in the air feel even sharper. Another flight attendant, younger and visibly uneasy, stood off to the side, pretending to busy herself with a stack of drink trays. James took in the scene, the way Veronica's jaw tightened, the subtle way her weight shifted from one foot to the other. She was bracing for something. "All right," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's hear it." Veronica hesitated just a second too long. "Sir, first class is a premium cabin, and we have to ensure that all reservations are correct. Your seats appear to have been flagged for review." James raised an eyebrow. "Flagged?" His voice remained level, but there was something dangerous about how carefully he chose his words. I booked these tickets weeks ago. They were confirmed, fully paid for. What exactly needs reviewing? She straightened her posture, grasping at authority. It's standard procedure, she said quickly. We reserve the right to verify seating assignments, especially in first class. James held her gaze. He could hear the slight waver in her voice, see the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She was uncomfortable. Good. He exhaled slowly, tilting his head. And yet, no one else has been asked to verify their seats. The young flight attendant flinched, glancing toward Veronica, who kept her expression neutral. But that flicker of hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Before she could respond, James pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly through his emails. A few taps, and then he held it up, the bright screen displaying his official confirmation. Here's my reservation, the same one I received after paying thousands of dollars for these seats. Would you like me to forward it to you? Veronica's mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at the phone. That won't be necessary, she said stiffly. James didn't lower the screen. Then why am I here? A beat of silence. We're just following protocol, she said, but there was no conviction behind her words. James studied her for a long moment, then slid his phone back into his pocket. He knew exactly what was happening here, and he could already see how this would play out. There was a certain inevitability to it, a script he'd seen unfold too many times before. He took a step forward, just enough that she had to lift her chin slightly to keep eye contact. I'm going back to my seat, he said, his voice smooth, unshaken. You can either explain to the entire first-class cabin why you singled me out, or you can let this go and do your job. Veronica's nostrils flared slightly. For a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then something shifted. Whether it was logic or self-preservation, he didn't know. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. But if there are any issues, I'll have to report them. James gave her a slow, measured nod. By all means. He turned and walked back toward the first-class cabin without another word. As he stepped through the curtain, he immediately caught Celeste's gaze. She didn't say anything, but the slight lift of her brow was enough. It's fine, he murmured, settling back into his seat. For now. Celeste didn't look convinced, and neither was he. James barely had time to settle into his seat before he felt it. The shift in the air. The kind of tension that wasn't loud or obvious but sat just beneath the surface, spreading like ripples in still water. Passengers nearby had noticed. Some stole quick glances, their curiosity poorly concealed behind half-lowered tray tables and flickering screens. Others pretended not to see, avoiding eye contact the way people do when they sense trouble but don't want to be involved. Celeste exhaled quietly, her fingers smoothing over Liam's curls as he busied himself with his toy plane. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. James tapped his fingers against the armrest, his expression unreadable. The encounter had gone exactly as he expected, and yet, there was something about it, something unfinished. Veronica hadn't backed down because she understood her mistake. She backed down because she didn't know how far she could push, and he wasn't convinced she was done trying. Movement at the front of the cabin confirmed it. Veronica had pulled another flight attendant aside, whispering in hushed tones. The younger woman, Grace, according to her name tag, looked uncertain, nodding slowly as Veronica gestured subtly toward James's seat. He watched without reacting, his expression carefully neutral, but his mind was already working, running through the possibilities. Veronica wasn't acting alone. She wasn't just some rogue employee making impulsive calls. No, this was calculated, deliberate. The way she had hesitated, the way she had phrased her words so carefully, this wasn't just about suspicion, it was about control. And James didn't take well to being controlled. A minute later, Veronica straightened her uniform and made her way back down the aisle, stopping just short of his seat. Sir, she said, her voice firm but measured, the captain has requested to speak with you. Celeste stiffened beside him. James let a slow breath out through his nose before looking up at her. The captain? Yes. She didn't elaborate. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then James stood, adjusting his blazer with an ease that felt almost deliberate. I'll be back in a minute, he murmured to Celeste. It wasn't reassurance, just a fact. She gave a slight nod, her fingers tightening subtly around Liam's hand. James followed Veronica back through the cabin, past the dividing curtain, past the rows of passengers who weren't paying attention, or at least pretending not to. The door to the cockpit wasn't open, but Veronica stopped just short of it, turning to face him in the small enclosed space near the galley. "The captain isn't here, is he?" James asked smoothly. Her lips pressed together. "Sir, if you'd just—" "Cut the act," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You pulled me back here because you wanted me out of my seat. Because you wanted to prove a point. So let's stop pretending." Veronica hesitated, and then for the first time she let something slip. A flicker of frustration, just enough to crack the surface of her carefully controlled expression. "Look," she said, lowering her voice, "you may have paid for those seats, but let's be honest. You don't exactly fit the profile of a first-class passenger." James felt it then. The moment everything clicked into place. He had seen it coming from the second they stepped on board. The extra scrutiny, the unnecessary questioning, the forced politeness barely covering the underlying message. It was the same script, the same tired narrative, but Veronica had just made a mistake, because now she had said it out loud. James smiled, slow and deliberate. It wasn't amusement, it was something colder. "Interesting," he murmured. Veronica blinked as if realizing just a second too late that she had given him exactly what he needed. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked back toward his seat, leaving her standing there. Her expression frozen in a way that told him one thing. She knew. She had just set something in motion that she couldn't take back. James returned to his seat without a word, but Celeste could read everything in his expression. The sharpness in his eyes, the way his fingers flexed briefly before settling on the armrest. Whatever Veronica had just said, it was exactly what he expected. But that didn't make it any less infuriating. Celeste didn't ask. She just shifted slightly, placing her hand over his. A silent understanding passed between them. Not now, not here, but soon. Liam, still lost in his own world, made quiet, whooshing sounds as he flew his toy plane over his lap, blissfully unaware. James exhaled slowly, forcing his body to relax. Across the aisle, a businessman in a gray suit glanced over, hesitated, then leaned slightly towards Celeste. His voice was low, careful. "Everything all right?" Celeste gave him a polite but distant smile. "Just a misunderstanding." The man nodded but didn't look convinced. He hesitated, then added, "Saw the way she singled you out, didn't sit right with me." James finally looked up, studying the man for a moment. He wasn't fishing for gossip. He was someone who had noticed, who had weighed the situation and decided it wasn't right. That in itself was rare. Before James could respond, a chime rang through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently awaiting final clearance for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." Veronica passed by, doing a last-minute check. She didn't look at them, not directly. But James caught the way her fingers curled slightly around the edge of a seat, the way her movements had lost their earlier sharpness. She was rattled. "Good." Celeste turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" James looked ahead, his expression unreadable. "Now," he murmured, "we let her dig her own grave." The plane began its slow taxi down the runway, the hum of the engines deepening as the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside, the sky had turned a soft shade of amber, the last remnants of daylight slipping beyond the horizon. Inside, the tension remained, thick and unmoving. James kept his gaze forward, but his mind was already a step ahead. He didn't need to push, not yet. Veronica had already made her mistake. Now it was just a matter of letting the situation play out. Across the aisle, the businessman gave him another glance before shifting in his seat. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows ahead, a woman with a pearl necklace shot a quick look in their direction before whispering something to her husband. Even the flight attendants who weren't involved seemed to be walking with a certain stiffness, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. Veronica had wanted control. Instead, she had drawn attention, and James knew how powerful that could be. A ding sounded overhead, and a flight attendant's voice crackled through the speaker. "Cabin crew, please take your seats for takeoff." Veronica made her way to her jump seat, fastening her harness with a sharp tug. James didn't look, but he could feel the weight of her presence a few rows behind him. The plane accelerated, the force of it pressing them gently back into their seats. Liam let out a small giggle, gripping his toy plane tighter as Celeste held his hand. James closed his eyes briefly. A few hours. That was all. Let her think she had won. Let her feel safe. Because by the time they landed, everything would be different. The plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers shifted, stretching and settling in for the flight. Soft murmurs filled the cabin, the rustle of blankets being unfolded, the quiet clink of glasses as flight attendants prepared for service. James remained still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't in a rush. Timing was everything. Veronica unbuckled from her jump seat, smoothing her uniform with one quick swipe. She moved through the aisle with forced composure, offering rehearsed smiles, but her body language was off. Too rigid, too controlled. She was nervous. Good. James knew people like her. The ones who operated on assumption, who believed their authority went unquestioned. They relied on deference, on the unspoken rules of power. The moment those rules were challenged, they unraveled. He waited. A few rows ahead, the businessman in the gray suit pressed the call button. A different flight attendant, Grace, approached him, leaning down slightly as he murmured something in a hushed tone. She nodded, glancing briefly in James's direction before disappearing toward the front. James didn't react, but he caught the exchange. He wasn't the only one who saw what was happening. Veronica passed by again, tray in hand. When she reached James's row, she hesitated just a fraction too long before addressing Celeste. "Would you like something to drink?" The tone was even, but James heard it, that undercurrent, the strained politeness. Celeste didn't flinch. "Just water." Veronica nodded and turned to James. "And for you, sir?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'll wait." Something flickered across her face. She gave a curt nod and moved on, but the tension had shifted again, small, subtle, but there. James tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest. Let the flight play out. Let her think she still held control, because when the time came, she wouldn't see it coming. James could feel it before he saw it, the slow, creeping shift in the energy around them. It wasn't immediate, not something most people would notice, but he wasn't most people. He had spent years in rooms where power wasn't just spoken, but silently negotiated, where control was less about who had the authority and more about who knew how to wield it. And right now, Veronica was losing her grip. She moved stiffly through the aisle, her usual practiced efficiency faltering ever so slightly, the way she adjusted the napkins on the drink cart twice before offering them out, the way she avoided glancing in his direction but remained acutely aware of where he was. She was trying to regain footing, trying to reset the dynamic in a way that placed her back in control. It wouldn't work. Across the aisle, the businessman, James still hadn't caught his name, leaned back slightly, eyes flicking toward him. It was a brief moment, a subtle acknowledgement. He wasn't involved, but he was watching. Others were too. A couple in the second row, an older woman with an expensive-looking handbag. None of them said anything, but that was the thing about social dynamics. Sometimes, silence said more than words. James let the moment breathe. Let Veronica sit in the discomfort of the attention she had drawn to herself. Let her wonder if she had miscalculated. She had. It wasn't long before she found a reason to pass by again. This time no tray, no service, just movement. A thinly veiled excuse to glance over to gauge if the situation was still in her hands. It wasn't. James turned slightly, catching her eye just long enough for the message to land. Not aggression, not intimidation, just certainty. And Veronica hesitated. A split-second pause in her step, almost imperceptible, but there. Her throat bobbed in a silent swallow before she quickly redirected her gaze and moved on. James exhaled slowly, shifting back into his seat. That was all he needed to know. The flight was long. Hours stretched by with quiet conversations, the occasional shuffle of passengers moving to the restroom, the low hum of the engine steady against the night. Celeste reached for her water, taking a slow sip before speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "She's unraveling." James hummed in agreement. He didn't need to say anything else. Liam, still blissfully unaware, had dozed off against Celeste's arm, his toy plane loosely gripped in his small hands. A moment of peace, untouched by the weight of the situation. James didn't want to disturb it, but the reckoning was coming. And by the time they landed, Veronica would wish she had never spoken to him at all. The plane cruised steadily through the night sky, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Most passengers had settled into quiet conversations, movies playing on small screens, the occasional clink of ice against glass. A sense of normalcy had returned, for everyone except Veronica. James didn't have to look at her to know. He could feel it. The way she lingered too long at the front of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. The way her movements were too careful, too measured, as if trying to calculate her next step. She had realized she lost control, but she hadn't accepted it yet. James remained relaxed in his seat, his hands resting loosely on the armrests, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in a rush. He had spent his life watching people like Veronica, people who assumed power was given, not earned. People who thought a uniform, a title, or a fleeting sense of authority could shield them from accountability. She was starting to learn otherwise. Celeste glanced at him briefly, the barest tilt of her head signaling the same thing he already knew. She could sense it too. A few rows ahead, a chime sounded as another passenger called for service. Grace, the younger flight attendant who had been hesitant earlier, moved quickly to respond. She carried herself differently than Veronica. No hesitation, no unnecessary posturing, just quiet efficiency. James made a note of that. Veronica, meanwhile, finally seemed to make a decision. She straightened her posture, smoothed down her uniform, and walked with forced confidence toward them. When she reached their row, she cleared her throat lightly. Mr. A pause, as if she'd momentarily forgotten his last name. No, not forgotten. Avoided. Sir, I wanted to check if everything is satisfactory with your flight. James turned his head slowly, finally giving her his full attention. The way her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the way her weight was slightly shifted onto one foot, it was all performance. She was testing the waters, trying to regain footing without outright admitting she had overstepped. Celeste answered before James could. It's been an interesting flight. Her voice was smooth, pleasant, but edged with something unmistakable. Veronica's lips pressed together briefly before she nodded. If there's anything I can do to make your experience more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. James studied her for a beat longer than necessary, letting her sit in the weight of her own discomfort. Then, just as smoothly, he nodded. Noted. Veronica gave a curt nod in return before quickly turning and walking away, but there was no doubt about it. She knew she had lost this round. James leaned back into his seat, exhaling through his nose. By the time they landed, she wouldn't just know she lost, she would know exactly who she had been dealing with. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of a long-haul flight. The occasional flicker of reading lights, the soft rustle of blankets, the low murmur of whispered conversations. James remained still, his mind sharp despite the calm around him. He could feel the anticipation building, the weight of inevitability pressing in. Veronica had made her move. Now, she was waiting for his. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching earlier stretched his legs, shooting James another glance. There was something unspoken in his expression, an understanding, an acknowledgement of what was happening. He wasn't the only one who had seen it. James didn't need to respond. He simply shifted slightly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, a small movement that said more than words. Veronica had disappeared toward the back of the cabin. Whether she was gathering her thoughts or stalling for time, it didn't matter. The moment she had singled him out, she had set something in motion that she couldn't stop. Celeste shifted beside him, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her water glass. She's trying to calculate a way out, she murmured, voice just loud enough for him to hear. James gave the smallest nod. She won't find one. Liam stirred slightly in his sleep, turning his face toward Celeste's arm. A reminder of why they were here, why this mattered. James wasn't the kind of man who sought conflict. He didn't need to. Power wasn't about how loud you were. It was about how you carried yourself, about how others reacted in your presence. And right now, Veronica was unraveling under the weight of a mistake she couldn't undo. A few minutes later, she reappeared. This time she wasn't alone. Grace, the younger flight attendant, trailed a step behind her, looking tense but composed. It was a deliberate choice, bringing backup, creating the illusion of authority where there was none. James let them approach, waited until Veronica had stopped just beside him before turning his gaze toward her. Mr. Anderson, she started, her voice carefully neutral, as if trying to erase the hostility from before. I wanted to personally apologize if there was any misunderstanding earlier. James caught Celeste's brief knowing exhale, if there was a misunderstanding, not an admission of wrongdoing, but an attempt to smooth things over without taking responsibility. Classic. He didn't respond immediately, letting the moment stretch just enough to make her shift her weight slightly. Understood, he said finally, his voice calm. Veronica hesitated, as if she had expected more. Expected an argument, maybe even an outburst. She wasn't prepared for the quiet control he wielded instead. Grace glanced between them, clearly aware of the tension but unwilling to step into it. After a beat, Veronica gave a tight nod and stepped away, but James didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. She was realizing, too late, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The final hour of the flight passed in quiet tension, but James knew better than to mistake silence for resolution. He felt it in the air, the unspoken weight of something inevitable. Celeste sensed it too. She didn't ask questions, didn't press for a plan. She knew James, knew how he operated. He didn't play the first move. He let his opponents walk themselves into checkmate. The captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing their descent. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, preparing for the landing. The cabin felt different now, the undercurrent of whispers never quite fading. Veronica was nowhere to be seen, but James wasn't surprised. She was trying to disappear, hoping to fade into the background before the wheels touched the ground. It wouldn't work. The moment the plane taxied to the gate, James reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A single message. Short, direct, sent. Celeste raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. The seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers stood, stretching, reaching for overhead bins. James remained seated, patient. Veronica finally reappeared, moving with calculated steps toward the exit. She thought she had made it. That was the mistake. Because the second she stepped into the jet bridge, 3 men in suits were waiting. She froze mid-step, her face losing its color. The lead man, tall, sharp-eyed, held up his badge just long enough for her to see. "Miss Summers, we need to have a conversation." Passengers filing out barely noticed, too focused on gathering their things. But James saw. He watched as Veronica's mouth opened slightly as if to protest before she caught herself. She wasn't being arrested. This wasn't about that. This was bigger. This was corporate. James stood, adjusting his blazer, feeling the weight of the moment settle into place. Celeste exhaled, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. "You planned this." James finally looked at her, a slow smirk curving his lips. "I warned her." Then, with Liam still sleepily clutching his toy plane, they stepped off the aircraft, leaving Veronica Summers to face the consequences of a lesson she had been too blind to see coming.